My name is Sarah, and I need to share something that happened to me because I know there are other women out there who might be going through something similar. And I want you to know that you're not alone, that your instincts matter, and that sometimes we have to be our own heroes when the system fails us. It was a warm Tuesday afternoon in early May when everything in my quiet suburban life in Colorado changed forever. I remember the exact moment because I was watering my petunias on the front porch, enjoying the first real warmth of spring after what felt like an endless winter. The moving truck pulled up across the street to the house that had been empty for months, and I watched with mild curiosity as movers began unloading furniture. We'd had such lovely neighbors there before, an elderly couple who'd moved to Florida to be closer to their grandchildren, and I was hoping whoever bought the place would be just as pleasant. I noticed him immediately, not because he was particularly memorable in appearance, but because of the way he stood there on the sidewalk, completely still, just watching my house while the movers worked around him. He was average height, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, with thinning brown hair and clothes that looked like they'd been picked randomly from different decades. But it was his stillness that made me uncomfortable, the way he just stood there, arms at his sides, staring directly at my house without any expression on his face. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself I was being paranoid. After all, people look at houses when they move into a new neighborhood, trying to get a feel for the place. Maybe he was just overwhelmed by the move, or tired from the journey. I went back to watering my flowers, but I could feel his eyes on me. And when I glanced up again, he was still there, still watching. This time our eyes met, and instead of looking away like most people would when caught staring, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly, neighborly smile. It was something else entirely, something that made my skin crawl. I finished watering quickly and went inside, locking the door behind me even though it was the middle of the day. Through my living room curtain, I watched as he finally turned away and began directing the movers. I told myself I was overreacting, that I'd been watching too many true crime documentaries, but something deep in my gut told me this man was going to be a problem. That evening, as I was cooking dinner for myself, I went upstairs to grab a sweater from my bedroom. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street, and as I entered my room, something outside caught my eye. There, in the window directly across from my bedroom, was a telescope. Not just any telescope, but one of those expensive-looking ones with multiple lenses and adjustments. And it was pointed directly at my bedroom window. My heart started racing. I stood there frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. Maybe it was for stargazing, I told myself. Maybe he was an amateur astronomer and this was just a coincidence. But even as I thought it, I knew I was lying to myself. The angle was wrong for looking at stars. It was aimed straight across, directly into my personal space. I immediately went downstairs and called my best friend Emma. She listened as I explained what I'd seen, and I could hear the concern in her voice when she said I should document everything and maybe talk to the police if I felt unsafe. We talked for over an hour, and by the end of the conversation, I felt a little better. Emma had always been my voice of reason, and she promised to come over the next day after work so I wouldn't feel so alone. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made me jump. The old oak tree outside my window that usually comforted me with its gentle swaying now seemed menacing, its branches scraping against the house like fingers trying to get in. I kept my curtains tightly closed and even pushed my dresser in front of the window for extra security. I felt ridiculous doing it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I was exhausted but determined to go about my normal routine. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, which I'd always loved because it gave me flexibility and comfort. But now, being alone in the house all day felt different. I found myself checking the locks repeatedly and jumping every time a car drove by. Around noon, I was making lunch when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see him standing there, my new neighbor. He was holding something in his hands and shifting his weight from foot to foot like an excited child. Every instinct told me not to open the door, but I also didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. Maybe he was just trying to be friendly. Maybe I'd misread the whole situation. I opened the door but kept the chain on, giving me just a few inches of space to talk through. Up close, I could see his face more clearly. His eyes were pale blue, almost gray, and they had an intensity that made me want to step back. His smile was too wide, showing too many teeth, and there was something off about the way he held himself, like he was vibrating with barely contained energy. "Hi there, neighbor," he said, his voice higher than I'd expected. "I'm Roger. Just moved in yesterday. Thought I'd come introduce myself." "Nice to meet you," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "I'm Sarah. Welcome to the neighborhood." "Sarah," he repeated, rolling my name around in his mouth like he was tasting it. "Beautiful name for a beautiful woman. You know what, Sarah? I have a feeling we're going to be very close. The moment I saw this neighborhood, I knew it was meant to be. And when I saw you yesterday, well..." He paused, his smile growing even wider. "Let's just say you're worth going to jail for." The words hit me like ice water. My hand tightened on the door, ready to slam it shut. Who says something like that to a stranger? The casual way he'd said it, like it was a compliment, made it even more terrifying. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I was sure he could hear it too. "I have to go," I said quickly, starting to close the door. "Wait." He thrust his hand forward, and I saw he was holding a small pot with a plant in it. "I brought you a housewarming gift. Well, reverse housewarming, I guess, since I'm the one who moved in." He laughed at his own joke, a sound that was more like a bark than genuine amusement. "Thanks, but I really need to go," I said again, not taking the plant. His smile faltered for just a moment, and I saw something flash in his eyes that made my blood run cold. Then the smile was back, but it didn't reach his eyes anymore. Of course. I'm sure you're busy. Beautiful woman like you must have lots to do. I'll just leave this here on your porch. We'll talk again soon, Sarah. Real soon." I shut the door and locked it, my hands shaking. Through the peephole, I watched him set the plant down and walk away, but he kept turning back to look at my house. When he finally crossed the street to his own home, I saw him stop at his window and adjust something. The telescope. He was adjusting the telescope. I left the plant on the porch. I didn't want anything from him in my house. Emma came over that evening as promised, and I told her about the encounter. She was even more concerned than she'd been on the phone, especially about his comment about me being worth going to jail for. We sat in my kitchen drinking wine and trying to figure out what to do. Emma thought I should file a police report right away, just to have something on record. I agreed, and we decided I'd go to the station first thing in the morning. That night, Emma stayed over, sleeping in my guest room. Even with her there, I felt uneasy. Around midnight, I got up to get a glass of water and couldn't resist peeking through the curtains in my bedroom. The telescope was still there. And worse, I could see a figure silhouetted in the window. Roger was awake, sitting behind the telescope. The next morning, Emma came with me to the police station. We waited for almost an hour before a tired-looking officer called us over to his desk. Officer Martinez had kind eyes, but looked like he'd heard every story imaginable. I told him everything, about the telescope, the creepy introduction, the comment about jail. I showed him the photos I'd taken of the telescope pointed at my window. I thought surely they'd take this seriously. Officer Martinez listened, occasionally taking notes, but I could see the skepticism growing on his face. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Ma'am, I understand you're concerned, but owning a telescope isn't illegal. Maybe he's into astronomy. As for the comment, well, some people just don't have good social skills. It was probably meant as a compliment, even if it was inappropriate." "A compliment?" Emma interjected. "He said she was worth going to jail for. How is that not a threat?" The officer shrugged. "Without any actual threats or actions, there's not much we can do. My advice? Get better curtains. Maybe introduce yourself properly when he's settled in. Sometimes these misunderstandings sort themselves out." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Another officer who'd been listening from a nearby desk chimed in. "You sure you're not imagining things? Sometimes when we're alone, our minds can play tricks on us. You said you work from home, right? Maybe you need to get out more, be around people." The condescension in his voice made my cheeks burn. Emma grabbed my hand under the desk, squeezing it in support and anger. We left the station feeling defeated. The system that was supposed to protect me had basically told me I was overreacting and possibly imagining things. Over the next few days, things got progressively worse. Roger seemed to be everywhere I went. When I went to get my mail, he was at his mailbox. When I took out the trash, he was taking out his. At first, I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, but the pattern was too consistent. He was watching me, learning my routines. The encounters were always the same. He'd wave enthusiastically and try to start conversations. He'd comment on what I was wearing, what I'd done to my hair, whether I looked tired. "Didn't sleep well last night, Sarah?" he asked one morning, and the implication that he knew when I slept made my skin crawl. I started changing my routines, going outside at random times, but he always seemed to appear within minutes. I installed security cameras around my house, making sure they were visible, hoping they'd deter him. Instead, he waved at them cheerfully whenever he passed by. A week after he'd moved in, I was working at my computer when I heard something at my door. When I looked outside, there was a gift basket on my porch. It was filled with expensive chocolates, bath products, and a book. Not just any book. It was the exact mystery novel I'd mentioned to Emma at our favorite coffee shop downtown the day before. We'd been discussing it while waiting in line, and I'd said I was planning to buy it that weekend. The realization that he'd been following me, listening to my conversations, made me physically ill. I ran to the bathroom and threw up, then sat on the bathroom floor crying. This wasn't just uncomfortable attention from a socially awkward neighbor. This was stalking. I called the police again, reporting the gift and the fact that he'd clearly been following me. The dispatcher sounded bored and said an officer would come by when available. 3 hours later, a different officer showed up. Officer Thompson was younger and seemed more sympathetic, but his hands were just as tied. "Without proof that he's following you, there's nothing we can charge him with. Giving gifts isn't a crime. Have you tried just telling him you're not interested?" "I'm scared of how he'll react," I admitted. "Well, until he does something actually illegal, our hands are tied. Document everything, and if he makes any threats or tries to touch you, call us immediately." After Officer Thompson left, I sat in my living room feeling completely alone and helpless. The system I'd believed would protect me was failing me at every turn. I thought about my ex-boyfriend Marcus and how the stalking had started similarly after our breakup 2 years ago. It had taken him showing up at my work and causing a scene before the police would issue a restraining order. Was I going to have to wait for Roger to escalate to that level too? That night, I was getting ready for bed, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy despite everything. I'd just changed into my pajamas when something made me glance toward the window. I'd kept the curtains shut tight, but there was a small gap where they didn't quite meet. Through that tiny space, I could see directly into Roger's window, and what I saw made me freeze in horror. He was at his telescope, but his hand wasn't on the controls. It was in his pants, moving rhythmically. His face was pressed against the viewfinder, and even from this distance, I could see the sick expression of pleasure on his face. But what made it worse, what made me want to scream, was when he pulled back from the telescope and looked directly at my window. He knew I was watching. He wanted me to see. Our eyes met across the space between our houses, and instead of stopping, instead of showing any shame, he smiled that terrible smile and moved his hand faster. I stumbled backward, knocking over my lamp in my haste to get away from the window. I ran to the bathroom and barely made it to the toilet before I threw up again. I spent that night on my couch, unable to go back into my bedroom. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that expression of sick pleasure. I called in sick to my client meetings the next day because I couldn't focus on anything except the horror of what I'd witnessed. As soon as the police station opened, I was there. This time, I demanded to speak to a supervisor. Sergeant Williams was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and a no-nonsense attitude. I told her everything, including what had happened the night before. I could barely get the words out, but I forced myself to be explicit because I needed her to understand the severity of the situation. For the first time, I felt like someone was actually listening. Sergeant Williams took detailed notes and asked follow-up questions. She called in Officer Martinez and had me repeat the story. I could see him shifting uncomfortably as he realized how badly he'd dismissed me before. "The problem," Sergeant Williams explained, "is that while this is clearly harassment and stalking behavior, proving it in court is difficult. He hasn't made direct threats, hasn't tried to break into your home, hasn't touched you. What he did last night is disgusting, but if he was in his own home and you happen to see through your window, so I have to wait until he actually attacks me?" I asked, incredulous. "No. she said firmly. We're going to increase patrols in your area. We'll have officers drive by regularly, document everything, times, dates, witnesses if possible. If he escalates even slightly, call us immediately. In the meantime, I'd recommend looking into a restraining order, though without more concrete evidence, it might be difficult to obtain. I left feeling marginally better, but still terrified. At least someone was taking me seriously now, but it didn't change the fact that Roger was still across the street, still watching, still escalating his behavior. Over the next week, the gifts continued. They appeared on my porch almost daily now. Flowers, jewelry, lingerie that made me want to burn my entire porch. Each gift was more personal than the last. A framed photo of me taken from his window. A necklace with a pendant that looked disturbingly like an eye. A music box that played a lullaby that I'd hummed while gardening the week before. I stopped going outside unless absolutely necessary. I had my groceries delivered, worked from my home office with the blinds drawn, and only left when Emma or another friend could come with me. My life was becoming smaller and smaller, constrained by fear. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Thursday, around 11 p.m. I was in bed, trying to read, but mostly just staring at the same page over and over. A soft knock at my door made me freeze. Who would come by this late? The knock came again, more insistent. I crept downstairs, my phone in one hand with 911 already dialed and my finger hovering over the call button. Through the peephole, I could see Roger. He was holding another box and swaying slightly, like he might be drunk. "Sarah," he called out, his voice slurred. "Sarah, I know you're in there. I have something special for you. Something to show you how much you mean to me. We're meant to be together, Sarah. I've been watching you for so long, learning everything about you. You're perfect." I held my breath, praying he'd leave. Instead, he set the box down and pulled something from his pocket. For a terrifying moment, I thought it might be a weapon. But it was a key. He was trying different keys in my lock. I hit the call button on my phone. 911, what's your emergency? Someone's trying to break into my house. I whispered urgently, giving them my address. He's my neighbor, and he's been stalking me. He's trying keys in my door right now. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher while Roger continued trying keys. None of them worked. I'd changed my locks the week before, thank God. But the fact that he had keys at all was terrifying. Where had he gotten them? Had the previous owners left spares somewhere? I heard sirens in the distance, and Roger must have too because he suddenly stopped. "Another time then, my love." He called through the door. Sweet dreams. By the time the police arrived, he was back in his house. They knocked on his door, but he didn't answer. They couldn't force entry without a warrant, but they took my statement and collected the box he'd left. Inside were 2 dead frogs, perfectly preserved and positioned in an embrace, dressed in tiny clothes. A note read, "I found them together, in love, just like us. I had to keep them together forever. Soon, my darling Sarah." Even the officers looked disturbed by the contents. They took photos and bagged everything as evidence. Sergeant Williams was called in, despite the late hour, and she looked grim as she examined the scene. "This is escalation," she said. "The preserved animals, the attempt to enter your home, the note implying future actions. This might be enough for a restraining order. Can you stay somewhere else tonight?" I packed a bag and went to Emma's apartment. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly, knowing Roger couldn't watch me through his telescope. But I couldn't stay there forever. This was my home, my life, and I was tired of letting him take it from me. The next day, Sergeant Williams called to tell me they'd brought Roger in for questioning. He'd been cooperative but creepy, insisting that I was sending him signals and that we were in a relationship. He claimed the keys were just him being prepared for when I inevitably invited him to move in. The preserved frogs were art that represented our love. They had to release him after a few hours. There wasn't enough to hold him. But the good news was that a judge had granted a temporary restraining order based on the evidence. Roger was ordered to stay at least 100 yards away from me and have no contact whatsoever. I felt a moment of relief, thinking this nightmare might finally be over. But anyone who's dealt with a stalker knows that piece of paper doesn't mean much to someone who's truly obsessed. I returned home the next day to find my front garden destroyed. Every plant had been ripped up, soil scattered everywhere. My security cameras showed Roger doing it at 3 in the morning, wearing all black and trying to avoid the cameras. But he'd missed one, and it caught him clear as day. This was a clear violation of the restraining order. I called the police immediately, and this time, they arrested him. I watched from my window as they led him away in handcuffs, feeling a mix of relief and fear. Would this make him stop, or would it make things worse when he got out? The answer came 3 days later when he was released on bail. The very first night he was back, I woke up to find him standing in my backyard, just standing there, staring up at my bedroom window. He was far enough away that he could claim he wasn't violating the 100-yard rule, but the intent was clear. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. The officer who responded looked tired and frustrated. "He's playing games," he said. "He knows exactly how far he can push without technically violating the order. Keep calling us. Every single time you see him. We need to build a pattern of harassment." But I was tired of being reactive, tired of waiting for the system to save me. If Roger was going to play games, then maybe it was time I learned the rules. I started researching everything I could about stalking cases and what had finally stopped the perpetrators. I read about women who'd had to completely uproot their lives, change their names, move across the country. I read about others who'd fought back through the legal system for years before getting justice. And I read about women who'd gotten creative, who'd found ways to turn the tables on their stalkers. An idea began to form. It was risky, possibly dangerous, but I was running out of options. Roger was escalating despite the restraining order. He was smart enough to stay just within the legal boundaries while still terrorizing me. So maybe I needed to be smarter. I called Emma and told her my plan. She was worried but understood my desperation. "Just be careful," she said. "And make sure you have backup plans. Don't let him get you alone in a situation you can't get out of." The plan was simple in concept, but would require all my courage to execute. I was going to pretend to befriend Roger, to make him believe I was finally returning his interest. It went against every instinct I had, but I needed to get close enough to find evidence of his obsession, something that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. I started small. The next time I saw him hovering at the edge of the restraining order boundary, instead of calling the police, I waved. The look of shock and joy on his face was disturbing. He waved back enthusiastically, pointing at the invisible line between us and shrugging as if to say, "What can we do?" Over the next few days, I gradually appeared more friendly. I would smile when I saw him, mouth hello from my window. I could see his excitement growing, his behavior becoming more bold. He started leaving gifts at the very edge of my property, technically not violating the order, but pushing boundaries. Then I took the biggest risk. I had my lawyer file a motion to drop the restraining order, claiming I'd overreacted and that Roger and I had worked things out. My lawyer thought I'd lost my mind, but I insisted. The judge was skeptical, but ultimately granted the request. The moment the order was lifted, Roger was at my door with flowers and champagne. "I knew you'd come around," he said, tears actually streaming down his face. I knew our love was real. I forced myself to smile. "I think we got off on the wrong foot," I said. "Maybe we could start over. As friends?" "Friends," he repeated, looking disappointed. Then his face brightened. "Friends is a start. Yes, let's be friends." And so began the most terrifying performance of my life. I invited Roger for coffee, keeping my phone recording in my pocket. I made sure my brother Michael knew exactly when Roger would be there and had him on speed dial. Michael lived 2 hours away, but he'd promised to call at exactly the time I specified so I'd have an excuse to end the interaction. Roger came over, bringing more gifts despite my protests that it wasn't necessary. He sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee and talking nonstop about fate and destiny and how he'd known from the moment he'd seen my photo on the real estate website that this was meant to be. "You saw my photo on a real estate website?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Oh, yes," he said eagerly. "I wasn't even looking in this neighborhood, but then I saw the listing for the house across the street, and there you were in the background of one of the photos, working in your garden. I knew immediately I had to buy that house. I had to be near you." The revelation that he'd bought a house just to be near me, based on a glimpse in a photo, was chilling. But I forced myself to nod and smile. "That's quite a story," I managed. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You're even more beautiful up close. Your bedroom is lovely, too. The way the morning light hits your face when you sleep." He trailed off, perhaps realizing he'd said too much. My skin crawled, but I kept my expression neutral. "The telescope," I said, "for watching you." He said simply, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. "I have so many beautiful photos. Would you like to see them sometime?" "Maybe," I said, my stomach churning. "Hey, what movie should we watch when you come over next time?" His face lit up like a child's on Christmas morning. We made plans for him to come over that weekend to watch a movie. When Michael called right on schedule, I pretended it was a work emergency and sent Roger home. The moment he left, I ran to the bathroom and threw up, then called Emma to tell her what I'd learned. "He bought the house just to stalk you?" she said, horrified. "Sarah, this is beyond creepy. Are you sure this plan is safe?" I wasn't sure of anything anymore, but I was committed now. I had to see it through. That weekend, Roger came over for our movie night. He suggested Silence of the Lambs, which felt like a threat in itself, but I agreed. I made sure all my recording devices were ready and hidden. As we watched the movie, he kept scooting closer on the couch, and several times I caught him staring at me instead of the screen. "You know," he said during a particularly tense scene, "I've always admired Hannibal Lecter's dedication. When he wants something, he doesn't let anything stop him." "That's an interesting take," I said carefully. "Don't you think passion like that is admirable? The willingness to do anything for what you want?" I excused myself to get more popcorn, taking a moment in the kitchen to calm my racing heart. When I returned, he'd moved to my spot on the couch, forcing me to sit even closer to him. His hand found its way to my knee during the movie, and it took everything I had not to recoil. After that night, Roger became even more bold. He started showing up at my door almost daily with invitations to his place. I went a few times, always making sure someone knew where I was, always looking for an opportunity to see what was in his locked bedroom. He would cook elaborate meals and tell me stories about his past that didn't quite add up. He claimed to be some kind of consultant, but was vague about what exactly he did. He mentioned an ex-girlfriend once, then quickly changed the subject when I asked about her. During one visit, I finally saw my chance. Roger had drunk more wine than usual and was getting drowsy. I'd come prepared, having ground up some over-the-counter sleep medication and hidden it in a small container. When he went to the bathroom, I quickly stirred it into his wine. I felt guilty about drugging him, but I was desperate for answers. As he became more sluggish, he started rambling about us, about our future together. "We'll be so happy," he slurred. "Just like in my pictures. You'll see. You'll love the collection." "What collection?" I asked, my heart racing. But he was fading fast. His eyes kept closing, and eventually he slumped over on the couch. I waited a few minutes to make sure he was really out, then went to work. His bedroom door was locked, as always, but I'd come prepared for that too. I searched his pockets carefully, finding his wallet. Inside, tucked between bills, was a small, unusual key. My hands were shaking as I tried it in the lock. It turned. What I found inside that room exceeded my worst nightmares. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with photos of me. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them. Photos of me sleeping, eating, working, shopping, meeting friends. Some were taken from his telescope, but many were clearly taken while he was following me around town. There were notebooks filled with detailed logs of my activities. 7:23 a.m., Sarah left for coffee shop, wearing blue dress, hair in ponytail. Beautiful. Entry after entry, documenting my every move for months before he'd even moved in. On a desk was a computer with multiple monitors. One showed a live feed from cameras he'd somehow placed around my property. Another had facial recognition software running, scanning through what looked like traffic cam footage for my face. But the worst part was the shrine. An entire corner of the room was dedicated to items of mine he'd stolen. Clothing I thought I'd lost at the laundromat. Hair from my hairbrush. Even used tissues and food wrappers I'd thrown away. Each item was carefully labeled with when and where he'd gotten it. I took photos of everything, my hands shaking so badly I had to retake several shots. I found a box under his bed with more disturbing contents. Women's underwear I didn't recognize, jewelry, driver's licenses. There were at least 5 different licenses, all women who looked somewhat like me. Was I just his latest obsession? One license was for a woman named Jennifer Moss from Michigan. I took a clear photo of it, planning to research her later. Another was for Maria Santos from Texas. Each license was carefully preserved in plastic, like trophies. I heard Roger stirring in the living room and quickly finished documenting everything I could. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, locked the door, and slipped the key back into his wallet. By the time he woke up, I was sitting in the chair across from him, pretending to read a magazine. "Did I fall asleep?" he asked groggily. "Just for a few minutes," I said. "The wine must have hit you hard. I should probably go." He protested weakly, but I was already gathering my things. As I left, he grabbed my wrist. Not hard, but firm enough to make me freeze. "You're not thinking of leaving me, are you, Sarah?" he asked, his eyes suddenly sharp despite his drowsy state. "Because that would make me very unhappy. And you don't want to see me unhappy." "Of course not," I forced myself to say. "I just have an early meeting tomorrow. I'll see you soon." He held my gaze for a long moment before releasing me. "Good, because we belong together, Sarah." Forever. I drove straight to the police station, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. This time, I bypassed the front desk and demanded to speak to Sergeant Williams immediately. When she saw the photos on my phone, her face went pale. "Jesus Christ," she muttered, scrolling through image after image. This is extensive. And these other licenses, we need to run these names immediately." Within hours, the station was buzzing with activity. The names on the licenses were all women who'd reported stalking incidents in their cities. 2 had eventually moved away and disappeared from public records. One, Jennifer Moss, had died in what was ruled an accidental fall down her stairs 3 years ago, shortly after reporting a stalker to the police. By morning, they had a warrant for Roger's arrest and to search his home. I watched from my window, surrounded by officers for my protection, as they led him out in handcuffs. He saw me watching and smiled that terrible smile, mouthing, "Forever," before they put him in the car. The search of his house revealed even more disturbing evidence. The basement had a soundproofed room with restraints bolted to the walls. There were detailed plans for kidnapping me, including my routines, the best times to take me, and how he planned to keep me hidden. They found evidence linking him to at least 3 other stalking cases across the country. Roger, whose real name turned out to be Robert Grayson, was charged with multiple counts of stalking, harassment, breaking and entering, theft, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. The federal authorities got involved due to the interstate nature of his crimes. He was denied bail and faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. But even with him locked up, I couldn't feel safe in my home anymore. Every corner held a memory of fear. Every window felt like a vulnerability. I stayed with Emma while I figured out what to do next, going to therapy to process the trauma of what I'd been through. The trial was hard. Having to face him in court to testify about everything he'd done was one of the most difficult things I've ever done. But I wasn't alone. 2 of the other women he'd stalked came forward to testify as well. We supported each other through the process, united by our shared trauma, but also by our strength. Roger was found guilty on all counts. The judge, a woman who'd clearly seen too many cases like this, sentenced him to 40 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 25. As they led him away, he turned to look at me one last time. The obsession was still there in his eyes, and I knew that even prison wouldn't change that. He would spend every day thinking about me, planning for a reunion that would never come. I sold my house and moved to a different state, starting fresh in a place where no one knew my story. I found a new job, made new friends, and slowly began to rebuild my sense of safety. But I also became an advocate for stalking victims, working with organizations to push for better laws and better training for law enforcement. Because here's what I learned through all of this. We can't always count on the system to protect us. Sometimes we have to be our own advocates, our own protectors. We have to trust our instincts when they tell us something is wrong, even when others try to dismiss our concerns. To anyone reading this who might be going through something similar, please know that you're not alone. Your fear is valid. Your instincts are valid. Don't let anyone tell you you're overreacting or imagining things. Document everything. Tell trusted friends and family. Be persistent with law enforcement, even when they don't take you seriously at first. And most importantly, don't blame yourself. It's not your fault that someone became obsessed with you. You didn't do anything to deserve it. You have the right to feel safe in your own home, to live your life without fear. It's been 3 years now since Roger was sentenced. I still have nightmares sometimes. I still check locks multiple times and feel uneasy when I notice someone looking at me for too long. But I've also found strength I didn't know I had. I've learned to trust myself and my instincts. And I've learned that while there are people like Roger in the world, there are far more good people willing to help and support us. I think about the other women he stalked, especially Jennifer Moss, who didn't survive her encounter with him. I carry their stories with me, a reminder of why it's so important to speak up, to fight back, to demand better from our systems of protection. My therapist tells me that healing isn't linear, that there will be good days and bad days. She's right. Some days I feel powerful and in control. Other days, a telescope in a store window can send me into a panic attack. But each day I choose to keep going, to not let Roger's obsession define the rest of my life. I've started dating again, slowly and carefully. It's hard to trust, to be vulnerable with someone new when you've experienced such a violation of boundaries. But I'm learning that not everyone who shows interest is a threat. That healthy attraction looks nothing like obsession. I still advocate for stalking victims, sharing my story when I can, pushing for legislative changes. I've testified before state committees about the need for better stalking laws, for mandatory training for law enforcement on how to handle these cases. It's exhausting work, but every time I get an email from someone saying my story helped them recognize their own situation and get help, I know it's worth it. There's no neat ending to a story like this. Roger is in prison, yes, but the impact of what he did lingers. I'm safe now, but I'll never have the carefree sense of security I had before. That's been stolen from me permanently. But in its place, I've found a different kind of strength. The strength that comes from surviving something terrible and choosing to help others do the same. If you're reading this because you're going through something similar, please reach out for help. Contact local domestic violence organizations, even if you haven't been physically hurt. They often have resources for stalking victims, too. Document everything. Trust yourself. And know that no matter how alone you feel, there are people who understand and want to help. You deserve to feel safe. You deserve to live without fear. And you deserve to be believed. That's my story. It's not a happy one, but it's mine. And I've chosen to use it to help others. Because if even one person reads this and recognizes their own situation, if even one person finds the courage to seek help or to trust their instincts, then sharing this pain will have been worth it. Stay safe, trust yourself, and never ever let anyone make you feel like your safety concerns don't matter. To all the women reading this who see themselves in my story, who are living with that constant fear and hypervigilance, who jump at shadows and check their locks obsessively, I see you. I believe you. And I promise you, there is hope. There is life after stalking. It's different than the life you had before, but it can still be good. You can still find joy and love and peace. It just takes time, support, and the courage to keep fighting for your right to live without fear. And to those who haven't experienced this but know someone who has, believe them. Support them. Don't minimize their fears or tell them they're overreacting. Be the friend or family member who shows up, who listens, who helps them feel less alone. You might just save someone's life. This is Sarah, signing off. Thank you for listening to my story. May you never need the lessons I've learned, but if you do, may you find the strength to survive and thrive despite it all. But wait, there's more I need to tell you. More about those dark days, about the small moments that kept me going, and about the aftermath that nobody really talks about. Because healing from something like this isn't just about the big dramatic moments. It's about the quiet battles we fight every single day. Let me take you back to one particular evening, about 2 weeks after Roger had moved in. I remember it was raining, one of those gentle spring rains that usually made me feel cozy and safe inside my home. I was trying to maintain some normalcy, cooking dinner while listening to a podcast about true crime. Ironic, I know, given what I was living through. The pasta water was just starting to boil when I heard it. A soft tapping at my kitchen window. At first, I thought it was just the rain or maybe a tree branch. But the rhythm was too regular. too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. My hand froze over the pot, and I slowly turned toward the window. The blinds were closed, but through a tiny gap, I could see a shadow. Someone was standing right outside my kitchen window, tapping on the glass with what looked like a long stick or pole. I knew it was him. Who else would it be? My heart started racing, and I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911. But then I hesitated. What would I say? Someone's tapping on my window? They'd already dismissed so much. Would they even come? The tapping continued for 5 more minutes. 5 long, terrifying minutes where I stood frozen in my kitchen, afraid to move, afraid to make a sound. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I heard footsteps moving away through the wet grass, and then nothing. I abandoned dinner, my appetite completely gone. Instead, I sat in my living room with all the lights on, clutching a baseball bat I'd bought for protection. Every sound made me jump. The house settling, the refrigerator humming, cars passing by. This is what he was doing to me, turning my own home into a prison of fear. The next morning, I found muddy footprints under my kitchen window and marks on the glass where he'd been tapping. I took photos, adding them to my growing file of evidence. But I didn't go to the police this time. What was the point? They'd already made it clear they wouldn't act until something serious happened. Emma came over that afternoon and we installed motion sensor lights around my house. "This is insane," she kept saying. "You shouldn't have to live like this." She was right, but what choice did I have? Moving wasn't financially feasible, and besides, part of me was stubborn. This was my home. I'd worked hard to buy it, to make it mine. Why should I be the one to leave? That stubbornness both helped and hurt me in the weeks that followed. It gave me strength to keep fighting, to keep documenting, to refuse to be driven from my home. But it also kept me in a dangerous situation longer than was perhaps wise. Roger's behavior became increasingly erratic. Some days he would stand at the edge of my property for hours just watching. Other days he would leave elaborate gifts, bouquets with flowers arranged to spell my name, custom jewelry with engravings that referenced private moments he'd observed, even a painting of me sleeping that made my skin crawl. The painting was the worst. It was actually quite skilled, which made it more disturbing. He'd captured details that he could only have seen through his telescope. The way I curled up on my left side, the stuffed elephant I'd had since childhood that I still kept on my nightstand, even the pattern on my favorite pajamas. The intimacy of it, the violation it represented, made me physically ill. But it was what happened with the painting that finally made me realize I needed a new strategy. When I'd taken it to the police as evidence, the officer on duty had actually admired it. "Whoever did this has real talent," he'd said. "Seems like someone really cares about you." I'd stared at him in disbelief, wondering how anyone could miss the inherent threat in someone painting you while you slept without your knowledge or consent. That's when I started researching other cases, looking for what had finally worked for other stalking victims. I spent hours online, reading forums, academic papers, legal documents. I learned about the psychology of stalkers, about extinction burst behaviors, about the average length of stalking cases. The statistics were depressing. Most stalking situations lasted an average of 2 years, with some going on much longer. I also learned that I was lucky in some ways. Roger hadn't yet tried to sabotage my work or relationships, though I lived in constant fear that he would. He hadn't contacted my family or friends directly. His focus was entirely on me, which was terrifying but at least contained the damage. During this research, I found a support group for stalking victims that met online. The first time I logged into a meeting, I cried with relief. Here were people who understood, who didn't minimize or question my experience. They shared their own stories, their strategies for staying safe, their small victories and setbacks. One woman, Lisa, had been stalked by a coworker for 3 years before he was finally arrested. She talked about the toll it took on her mental health, how she'd developed agoraphobia and could barely leave her house even after her stalker was imprisoned. "The physical threat might be gone," she said, "but the psychological damage lingers. Be prepared for that." Another member, David, yes, men get stalked too. Something that often gets overlooked. shared how his female stalker had used social media to destroy his reputation, creating fake accounts and spreading lies about him. He'd lost his job and several friendships before people realized what was happening. His story reminded me to be vigilant about my online presence, to lock down all my social media accounts. Through the support group, I learned about evidence-gathering techniques I hadn't thought of. One member suggested keeping a bound notebook instead of loose papers for documentation, as it would be harder to dispute in court. Another recommended getting a small body camera for when I had to leave the house, to capture any encounters. These practical tips made me feel less helpless, gave me actions I could take. It was also through this group that I first heard about the strategy of managed contact, the idea of controlling interactions with your stalker to gather evidence. It was controversial, with some members strongly against it due to the danger involved. But for others, it had been the key to finally getting law enforcement to take action. I thought about it for weeks before deciding to try it. The risk was enormous, but I was desperate. Roger was escalating anyway. His gifts were becoming more disturbing, his watching more blatant. The preserved frogs had been a turning point for me. There was something so wrong about taking two living creatures and killing them for his twisted idea of romance. It showed a level of disconnection from reality that terrified me. The night he tried the keys in my door was when I knew I'd made the right choice to change my locks. But it also showed me how determined he was. Where had he gotten those keys? Had he befriended a locksmith? Stolen them from the previous owners? The possibilities kept me up at night. When I finally put my plan into action, pretending to warm up to Roger, the hardest part was controlling my physical reactions. Every time he smiled at me, my skin crawled. When he touched my knee during that movie night, I wanted to run screaming from the room. The smell of his cologne, too strong, cloying, made me nauseous. But I forced myself to endure it, knowing I needed evidence that would be impossible to dismiss. Those weeks of pretending to be his friend were some of the hardest of my life. I had to shower immediately after every interaction, scrubbing my skin until it was red, trying to wash away the feeling of his eyes on me. I barely ate, my stomach in constant knots. Emma was my lifeline during this time, checking in multiple times a day, ready to call the police if I didn't respond. The day I drugged Roger and discovered his room of obsession, I was taking a huge risk. If he'd woken up, if he'd caught me, I don't know what would have happened. But I was past the point of playing it safe. The system had failed me repeatedly, and I needed undeniable proof. What I found in that room still haunts my nightmares. The sheer volume of surveillance was staggering. He had documented every aspect of my life in obsessive detail. There were charts tracking my menstrual cycle, notes about my food preferences, analysis of my social connections. He'd created a whole fantasy life for us, complete with wedding plans and names for our future children. The other women's licenses were what really broke me. Knowing I wasn't his first victim, that he'd done this before, that at least one woman had died. It was overwhelming. I thought about Jennifer Moss, about her family who'd lost her, about how the police had ruled it an accident. How many accidents were actually the final act of a stalker whose obsession had reached its deadly conclusion? After Roger's arrest, I thought I'd feel relief. And I did. Briefly. But what followed was unexpected. A crushing depression and anxiety that left me unable to function. Without the immediate threat to focus on, all the suppressed trauma came flooding out. I couldn't sleep, couldn't work, could barely leave Emma's apartment. My therapist explained it was common. When we're in survival mode, we push down our emotions to function. But once the threat is gone, everything we've been holding back demands to be processed. She specialized in trauma therapy and had worked with many stalking victims. "You've been in a war zone," she told me. "Of course you're going to have PTSD." The symptoms were classic. Hypervigilance, flashbacks, nightmares, avoidance of anything that reminded me of Roger. I couldn't watch movies with telescopes in them. The smell of his cologne would send me into a panic attack. Even seeing someone who looked vaguely like him from behind would make my heart race. But there were also symptoms I didn't expect. The guilt, for instance. Guilt that I'd drugged him, even though it was to gather evidence. Guilt that I'd pretended to be his friend, even though it was for my safety. Guilt that I'd survived when Jennifer Moss hadn't. My therapist called it survivor's guilt, common among those who'd escaped dangerous situations. There was anger, too. So much anger. At Roger, obviously, but also at the system that had failed me, at the officers who'd dismissed my concerns, at society for not taking stalking seriously until someone gets hurt or killed, at myself for not somehow preventing this, even though I knew that was irrational. The trial preparation was its own form of torture. Having to relive every moment in detail, knowing I'd have to face him in court, was daunting. The prosecutor was kind but thorough, walking me through my testimony multiple times. She warned me that Roger's defense attorney would try to paint me as someone who'd led him on, who'd encouraged his attention, then changed her mind. She was right. The defense attorney, a sharp-dressed woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, tried every trick in the book. She questioned why I'd waved at Roger after getting the restraining order, why I'd invited him into my home, why I'd dropped the order. She tried to make it seem like I was a manipulative woman who'd played with a lonely man's feelings, but the evidence was overwhelming. The photos from his room, the testimonies from his other victims, the detailed plans for kidnapping. It painted a clear picture of a dangerous predator. When the other women testified, sharing their own experiences with Roger, I saw the jury's faces change. This wasn't about one misunderstanding. This was a pattern of predatory behavior. Roger's testimony was chilling in its delusion. He genuinely seemed to believe we were in a relationship, that I'd been sending him signals, that everything he'd done was out of love. He cried on the stand, talking about how I'd betrayed him by involving the police. The disconnect from reality was complete. When the guilty verdict came down, I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected. Just a hollow relief and exhaustion. Justice had been served, but it couldn't undo what had been done. It couldn't give me back my sense of safety or erase the memories. Moving to a new state was both liberating and terrifying. Starting over somewhere where nobody knew my story meant I could be just Sarah again, not that stalking victim. But it also meant leaving my support system, starting fresh in a place where I knew no one. I found a small apartment in a secure building with good lighting and multiple locks. I chose a unit on the 3rd floor, high enough to feel safe from ground-level windows, but low enough to escape in an emergency. The hypervigilance that had developed during my ordeal influenced every decision. My new job was remote, which felt safer but also more isolating. I slowly built a new life, joining a gym, finding a new therapist, eventually making friends. But I was different now. More cautious, more aware of my surroundings, quicker to trust my instincts when something felt off. Dating was a minefield I avoided for the first 2 years. The thought of being vulnerable with someone new, of letting them into my space, was terrifying. When I finally did start dating, I was hypersensitive to any red flags. A guy who texted too much after the first date? Blocked. Someone who showed up at my workplace unannounced to surprise me? Immediate end to that relationship. My therapist helped me work through the difference between reasonable caution and trauma responses. Not every person who showed interest was a threat. Not every gift was a manipulation. But learning to trust again was a slow, difficult process. The advocacy work started small. I began by sharing my story anonymously online, connecting with other survivors. Then I started speaking at support groups, sharing what I'd learned about evidence gathering and navigating the legal system. Eventually, I was invited to speak at conferences and to law enforcement training sessions. Each time I told my story, it got a little easier, though certain parts still make my voice shake. But seeing the impact, officers who finally understood why they needed to take these cases seriously, survivors who felt validated and empowered, made it worthwhile. I've worked with legislators to push for better stalking laws. Did you know that in many states, the first instance of stalking is only a misdemeanor? That cyberstalking laws haven't kept pace with technology? That there's often no mental health evaluation required for convicted stalkers? These are the things I'm fighting to change. One of my proudest achievements was helping to establish a fund for stalking victims who need to relocate for safety. Moving is expensive, and many victims stay in dangerous situations because they can't afford to leave. The fund, named after Jennifer Moss, has helped dozens of people escape their stalkers. I still have bad days. Last month, I was at a coffee shop when I noticed a man at another table looking at me. He was probably just daydreaming or people-watching, but my body went into full panic mode. Heart racing, palms sweating, that old familiar urge to run. I had to leave my half-finished latte and go sit in my car until I calmed down. My current therapist specializes in EMDR, a therapy technique that helps process trauma. It's been incredibly helpful in reducing the intensity of flashbacks and triggers. I can now see a telescope in a store without having a panic attack, though I still feel uncomfortable. I've also found healing in unexpected places. I took up kickboxing, finding power in knowing I can defend myself. I adopted a large dog, a gentle giant named Bruno, who makes me feel safer and forces me to go outside for walks. I joined a hiking group, reclaiming my love of nature that Roger had tainted with his surveillance. There's a man in my hiking group, Thomas, who's become a good friend. He knows my story. I told him early on, not wanting to waste time with someone who couldn't handle it. His response was perfect. He listened, asked how he could help me feel safe, and has never treated me like a fragile victim. We've been dating for 6 months now, taking things incredibly slowly. He texts when he says he will, shows up when planned, and has never once surprised me or pushed boundaries. It's healing to experience healthy interest, to remember that this is what normal looks like. But I'm changed forever by what happened. I notice things others don't. The man who's been in the same aisle as me for too long at the grocery store. The car that seems to be following the same route as me. The feeling of being watched. Most of the time it's nothing, but I've learned to trust my instincts rather than dismiss them. I think about Roger sometimes, wondering if he thinks about me in his cell. The prosecutor told me he'd decorated his cell with drawings of me, that he still insists we're meant to be together. It's a chilling reminder that while he's physically contained, the obsession remains. I got a letter from him once, forwarded through his lawyer. I didn't open it. My therapist and I burned it together in a little ceremony, watching his words turn to ash. It was surprisingly cathartic. I've connected with his other victims, the ones who are willing to come forward. We have a small support group, bonded by our shared experience with the same predator. We check in on each other, celebrate victories, offer support during setbacks. There's something powerful about connecting with people who truly understand. One of them, Maria, told me that Roger had stalked her for 6 months before she managed to get a restraining order and move away. She'd never reported the full extent of it, too traumatized and afraid. She thanked me for being the one to finally stop him, but I reminded her that we all played a part. Her license in his collection was part of what upgraded the charges. The impact on my family was something I didn't fully appreciate until later. My parents aged visibly during the ordeal, worried sick about their daughter living in fear. My brother Michael blamed himself for living so far away, for not being there to protect me. We've all had to work through our trauma from this experience. My mother admitted she checks my social media obsessively now, looking for signs that I'm okay. My father wanted to buy me a gun, though I declined. Statistics show that's more likely to be used against you in these situations. Michael calls me every few days just to hear my voice and know I'm safe. They came to the trial, sitting behind me every day, a wall of support against Roger's attempts to make eye contact. When the verdict was read, I heard my mother sob with relief. Justice for me was justice for them too. They'd been victims of Roger's terrorism as well, forced to watch their loved ones suffer. The financial impact was substantial too, something people don't often talk about. The security systems, the legal fees, the therapy, the cost of moving, it added up to tens of thousands of dollars. I was lucky to have some savings and family support, but many victims don't. The fund I helped establish addresses this, but there's so much more work to be done. I've become something of an expert on home security, advising other stalking victims on everything from camera placement to door reinforcement. It's knowledge I wish I didn't have, but I'm glad I can use it to help others feel safer. There are small victories I celebrate now. Going a whole day without thinking about Roger, sleeping through the night without checking the locks, feeling excited rather than anxious when the doorbell rings. These might seem like nothing to someone who hasn't lived through stalking, but to me, they're huge achievements. I've also learned to find joy in unexpected places, the solidarity among survivors, the dedication of the good police officers who do take these cases seriously, the friends who stood by me through the worst of it, the strength I found in myself that I didn't know existed. My story isn't unique, unfortunately. Every 2 minutes, someone in America becomes a victim of stalking. Most are women, though men are victims too. Many never report it, suffering in silence, hoping it will stop on its own. It rarely does. If you're reading this and recognize your own situation, please know that you deserve help. You deserve to be believed. You deserve to feel safe. It might take time. It might take persistence. But there is hope. There is life after stalking. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Build a support network. Don't let anyone minimize your experience or make you feel like you're overreacting. And remember, the shame belongs to the stalker, not to you. You've done nothing wrong by existing, by living your life, by being someone who caught the attention of a disturbed individual. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate has been long and difficult. There are still days when I feel more like a victim than a survivor, when the fear feels fresh and overwhelming. But those days are becoming less frequent. I recently spoke at a conference for law enforcement, sharing my story with a room full of officers. Afterward, a young female officer approached me with tears in her eyes. She'd been dismissive of a stalking complaint the week before, she admitted. But after hearing my story, she realized she needed to take it seriously. She was going to follow up with the victim immediately. Moments like that make everything worth it. Every sleepless night, every panic attack, every moment of terror. If sharing my experience can help even one person, can change even one officer's perspective, can save even one life, then it has meaning. Roger took a lot from me. My sense of safety, my ability to trust easily, my carefree nature. But he didn't take everything. He didn't take my voice, my strength, my ability to help others. In trying to control me, he created an advocate who will spend the rest of her life fighting against predators like him. I still live in my new city, in my secure apartment with Bruno by my side. I've built a good life here, different from the one I'd planned, but meaningful in its own way. I have work that matters, friends who understand, a relationship that's healthy and healing. Some nights I stand on my balcony and look at the stars, really look at them, not through a telescope, but with my own eyes. I think about how vast the universe is, how small we all are, how temporary our troubles in the grand scheme of things. It helps put things in perspective. But then I come inside, check my locks, just once now, not the compulsive multiple times of before, and settle in for the night. Because while our troubles may be temporary in the cosmic sense, they're very real in the moment. And we have to deal with them, survive them, and help others do the same. That's my story. All of it. The fear and the fight, the trauma and the triumph. It's not the story I would have chosen for myself, but it's the one I'm living. And I'm determined to make something meaningful from it. To Roger, wherever you are in your cell, know this. You didn't win. You didn't break me. You didn't get the control you craved. Instead, you created someone who will spend her life making sure people like you are stopped, prosecuted, and prevented from harming others. To my fellow survivors, you are not alone. You are believed, you are stronger than you know, and you deserve every happiness that life has to offer, free from fear and full of hope. And to everyone else, believe the people in your life who come to you with fears about being watched, followed, or harassed. Support them. Stand by them. Be the friend or family member who makes a difference. Because in the end, that's how we stop the Rogers of the world. Not just with laws and locks, but with community, support, and the refusal to let fear win. Thank you for listening to my story. May it help someone, somewhere, somehow. And may we all work toward a world where stories like mine become increasingly rare, where early intervention is the norm, where victims are believed the first time, and where everyone can feel safe in their own homes. This is Sarah, finally, truly signing off. But the fight continues, and I'll be here, working to make things better. One story, one law, one saved life at a time. Actually, wait. There's something else I need to share with you. Something I haven't talked about publicly before, but I think it's important. It's about the dreams, not just the nightmares, but the dreams that were somehow worse. You see, our brains do this strange thing when we're under extreme stress. Sometimes, in an attempt to process trauma, they create scenarios that confuse and disturb us even more. About a month into Roger's stalking, before things had escalated to their worst, I started having dreams where everything was normal, where Roger was just a friendly neighbor who waved hello and minded his own business, where I felt safe. These dreams were so vivid, so peaceful, that waking up to reality was crushing. For a few moments each morning, I'd lie in bed thinking maybe I'd imagined everything. Maybe I was the one losing touch with reality. Then I'd see the telescope through my curtain, or find another gift on my porch, and the truth would come crashing back. My therapist later explained this was my mind's way of trying to cope, to give me moments of respite even if they weren't real. But at the time, it felt like another form of torture. I couldn't even escape him in my sleep. There was one particular morning that stands out. I'd had one of those normal dreams, and I woke up feeling oddly refreshed. For about 30 seconds, I felt like my old self. Then I heard it. The sound of someone in my backyard. It was 5:47 a.m., still dark outside. My heart immediately started racing as I crept to my window and carefully peered through the curtains. Roger was in my garden, kneeling among my tomato plants. At first, I couldn't understand what he was doing. Then I realized he was planting something. As the dawn light grew stronger, I could see him carefully placing small objects in the soil around my vegetables. When he finally left, I waited another hour before going outside, baseball bat in hand. What I found still makes my stomach turn. He'd planted dozens of small plastic eyes, the kind you'd use for craft projects, throughout my garden. They stared up at me from the soil, a grotesque invasion of the one space that had still felt somewhat mine. The message was clear. He was always watching, even when he wasn't physically there. I spent hours pulling those eyes out of the ground, my hands shaking with rage and fear. Some were buried deep, and I had to dig to find them all. By the time I finished, my beautiful garden was destroyed, but I couldn't bear the thought of leaving even one of those eyes in my soil. That was the day I stopped eating vegetables from my garden. Actually, I stopped gardening altogether. Another thing he stole from me. My love of growing things, of nurturing life. Even now, years later, I can't plant anything without remembering those staring plastic eyes. The psychological warfare was relentless. Roger seemed to understand that the physical threats were what would get him arrested, so he stayed just within legal boundaries while destroying my peace of mind. He would stand at the edge of my property line. I'd measured it, marked it clearly, and just wave. For hours sometimes. Just standing there, waving, smiling. I tried to ignore him at first, going about my business as if he wasn't there. But have you ever tried to focus on work while someone stands outside your window waving at you? It's impossible. Your body stays in a constant state of alert, adrenaline pumping, waiting for them to cross that line. One day, I decided to document how long he would stand there. I set up my phone to record through the window and went about my day, checking periodically. He stood there for 6 hours and 43 minutes. He didn't sit, didn't take a break, barely shifted his weight. Just stood there, waving whenever he caught sight of me through a window. When I showed this to the police, they said it was weird, but not illegal. He was on public property. He wasn't making threats. One officer actually suggested that maybe he had some form of autism and didn't understand social boundaries. The infantilization of a calculated predator was infuriating. I want to talk about the physical toll this took on my body, because I don't think people realize how damaging prolonged fear can be. Within 2 months of Roger's campaign, I'd lost 20 pounds I couldn't afford to lose. My hair was falling out in clumps. I developed a stress rash that covered my arms and neck. My period stopped entirely for 3 months. My body was so stressed it shut down non-essential functions. I went to my doctor, hoping she could help or at least document the physical effects for evidence. She was sympathetic but also concerned about my mental health. She prescribed anti-anxiety medication and sleeping pills, which I was reluctant to take. What if Roger broke in while I was sedated? What if I couldn't wake up in time to call for help? This is the impossible balance stalking victims have to maintain, taking care of our health while staying hypervigilant for our safety. I compromised by taking half doses, enough to take the edge off, but not enough to impair my reaction time. Even that felt like a risk. The isolation was another weapon in Roger's arsenal. I slowly stopped seeing friends because I didn't want to put them in danger. What if he followed me to their houses? What if he started targeting them to get to me? I became a hermit, only leaving for essentials, and even then, I was constantly looking over my shoulder. My friend Emma refused to be pushed away. She would come over with wine and movies, insisting on maintaining our friendship. But even she could only take so much. I saw the strain in her eyes, the way she jumped at sounds when she was at my house. She never said it, but I knew my situation was affecting her mental health too. The ripple effects of stalking extend far beyond the primary victim. My work suffered tremendously. As a freelance graphic designer, I needed creativity and focus, two things in short supply when you're in survival mode. I missed deadlines, turned in subpar work, lost clients. My income dropped by 60% over those months. Financial stress on top of everything else felt crushing. One client, someone I'd worked with for years, asked if everything was okay after I submitted a project with multiple errors. I broke down and told her what was happening. Her response surprised me. She'd been stalked in college and understood completely. She gave me a 2-week extension and shared her own story of survival. It was a moment of connection in my isolation that meant more than she probably knew. But not everyone was understanding. Some people, even well-meaning ones, said things that hurt. Why don't you just move? As if I could afford to break my lease and relocate on a moment's notice. Have you tried talking to him directly? As if reasoning with an obsessed stalker was a safe option. Maybe you're misinterpreting his intentions. As if the telescope pointed at my bedroom could be interpreted any other way. The worst comment came from my own aunt at a family dinner I forced myself to attend. Well, you must have done something to encourage him initially, she said over dessert. Men don't just become obsessed for no reason. I left immediately, driving home through tears of rage and hurt. That was the last family gathering I attended for over a year. This victim blaming is so common in stalking cases. People want to believe there's a reason, something the victim did that they can avoid doing themselves. It's a protective mechanism. If stalking happens because of something you did, then they can prevent it by not doing that thing. The reality that stalkers can fixate on anyone for any reason is too scary for many people to accept. I need to tell you about the roses. About 3 months into this nightmare, I woke up to find my front door covered in roses. Not just a bouquet. Hundreds of roses, their stems woven through my door handle, tucked into every crevice, creating a wall of red. The smell was overwhelming, sickeningly sweet. But it was what I found when I looked closer that made me call the police immediately. Each rose had a small photo attached to its stem. Photos of me throughout my life that he couldn't have taken. Childhood pictures, high school graduation, college parties. Photos I recognized from my social media accounts, but also ones I didn't remember posting anywhere. It turned out Roger had been contacting people from my past, pretending to be organizing a surprise party for me, asking for photos. Most people had ignored him, but enough had responded to give him a disturbing collection of my history. He'd printed them all out, tiny 2-inch squares, and attached them to the roses like some twisted art installation. The violation of him reaching into my past, contacting people I knew, was almost worse than the physical stalking. He was trying to claim ownership of not just my present, but my entire life story. When the police finally arrived, even they seemed disturbed by the display. We discovered he'd reached out to over 50 people. Old classmates, distant relatives, former coworkers. Most had found his requests strange and ignored them, but about a dozen had sent photos, thinking they were helping with a sweet gesture. When the police contacted them as part of the investigation, they were horrified to learn the truth. This incident finally seemed to shift something in how law enforcement viewed my case. The elaborate nature of it, the clear obsession, the effort he'd put into researching my entire life. It was harder to dismiss as a misunderstanding or social awkwardness. Sergeant Williams was assigned to my case shortly after this, and things slowly began to change. But Roger adapted too. He seemed to sense that he'd pushed too far with the roses, that he was now genuinely on law enforcement's radar. He pulled back slightly, but in some ways that was worse. Instead of daily gifts, they became weekly, but more disturbing. Instead of standing at my property line for hours, he would appear for just a few minutes at unpredictable times. The unpredictability was its own form of torture. At least when he had patterns, I could prepare myself mentally. Now, I never knew when he'd appear. I might go days without seeing him, starting to relax slightly, and then suddenly he'd be there at my mailbox at 2 a.m., just standing, staring at my house. Sleep became my enemy. I would doze fitfully, waking at every sound. I installed an app on my phone that connected to my security cameras, allowing me to check them without getting out of bed. I probably checked those cameras 50 times a night, looking for movement, for any sign of him. The exhaustion was cumulative. After months of poor sleep, my cognitive function declined. I would forget simple things, struggle to hold conversations, find myself staring blankly at my computer screen, unable to remember what I was doing. This is what prolonged trauma does. It doesn't just affect your emotions, it impacts every aspect of your functioning. One night, around 3 a.m., I was doing my usual camera check when I saw something that made my blood freeze. Roger wasn't in his usual spots. Not at the property line, not by the mailbox. He was on my roof. Sitting on my roof, directly above my bedroom, just sitting there in the darkness. I called 911 immediately, whispering as if he could hear me through the ceiling. The dispatcher kept me on the line while units were sent. Those 20 minutes waiting for the police felt like hours. I huddled in my closet, clutching a kitchen knife, imagining every creak of the house was him finding a way inside. When the police arrived, he was gone. But they found evidence he'd been there. Disturbed shingles, footprints. He'd accessed the roof by climbing a tree in my backyard, the same oak whose branches I'd once found comforting. They documented everything, and this incident became crucial in establishing the pattern of escalation. The tree came down the next week. I hired a service to remove it completely, despite it being healthy and beautiful. Another casualty of Roger's obsession. I cried as I watched it fall, mourning the loss of something that had been there long before either Roger or I moved to the neighborhood. People often ask me why I didn't get a gun. The truth is, I thought about it constantly. I went to a gun range with my brother, learned how to shoot, even picked out a model I felt comfortable with. But something held me back from making the purchase. Maybe it was the statistics I'd read about guns being more likely to be used against victims than by them. Maybe it was the fear that in my exhausted, paranoid state, I might make a tragic mistake. Or maybe it was the stubborn refusal to let Roger turn me into someone who needed a weapon to feel safe in my own home. Instead, I armed myself with knowledge. I took self-defense classes, learning not just physical techniques, but situational awareness. The instructor, a former police officer named Janet, took special interest in my case. She taught me things they don't cover in regular classes: how to use household items as weapons, how to create obstacles to slow down an intruder, how to make yourself a hard target. The goal isn't to win a fight, Janet told me. It's to survive long enough to get help. She taught me to sleep with my car keys next to my bed. The panic button could alert neighbors. She showed me how to wedge a chair under a doorknob properly, how to use hairspray as a defensive tool, how to make my windows harder to break through quietly. This training gave me back some sense of control, even if it was small. I might not be able to stop Roger's obsession, but I could make myself a more difficult target. I could be prepared instead of just reactive. The financial strain continued to mount. Between the security systems, the tree removal, the therapy, the self-defense classes, and the lost income, I was burning through my savings at an alarming rate. I applied for victim compensation funds, but was told stalking didn't qualify unless there was physical violence. Another way the system fails victims. Apparently, psychological torture doesn't count. I started a GoFundMe out of desperation, though it felt humiliating to ask for help so publicly. Emma helped me write the description, making sure to include enough detail to be believed, but not so much that it felt exploitative. The response surprised me. Not just donations, but messages from other stalking victims, sharing their stories, offering advice and solidarity. One donation came with a note that stays with me. From one survivor to another. The system failed me too, but we're stronger than they know. Use this to stay safe. It was for $500, a significant amount from someone who understood the financial toll of survival. Through the GoFundMe, I connected with a journalist named Patricia who was working on a series about stalking laws. She interviewed me several times, careful to protect my identity while sharing my story. When the article was published, it included not just my experience, but those of 5 other victims, showing the pattern of system failures. The article sparked conversations, at least locally. The police chief was questioned about their handling of stalking cases. Training sessions were promised. It felt like a small victory, even if it came too late for me. I want to talk about hope, because even in the darkest moments, there were glimmers of it. The locksmith who changed my locks for free when he learned why I needed them. The neighbor who started walking her dog past my house more frequently after noticing the police visits. The grocery store clerk who began watching for Roger and would text me if he showed up so I could avoid him. These small acts of kindness and protection formed a network of support I hadn't expected. It wasn't enough to stop Roger, but it was enough to remind me that there were more good people than bad, that community could form even around something as dark as stalking. The turning point in my decision to befriend Roger came after an incident at the post office. I'd gone to mail some work to a client, thinking mid-morning on a Tuesday would be safe. Roger appeared within minutes, getting in line behind me, standing too close, breathing on my neck. "Fancy meeting you here," he said, as if it was a coincidence. "Mailing something special? Maybe to a boyfriend?" The jealousy in his voice was palpable. I ignored him, completed my transaction, and left quickly. But he followed me to my car, talking the whole time about fate and destiny, and how we couldn't fight what was meant to be. When I tried to close my car door, he held it open. Not aggressively, but firmly enough that I couldn't close it without a struggle. "You can't keep ignoring me, Sarah," he said, his mask slipping slightly. "I've been patient. I've been romantic. I've shown you in every way possible how much you mean to me. When are you going to stop playing hard to get?" The entitlement in his voice, the complete disconnect from reality, was terrifying. In his mind, my fear was a game. My attempts to avoid him were playing hard to get. He'd constructed an entire relationship that existed only in his head. I managed to close my door and drive away, but his words echoed. He thought he'd been patient. What would happen when that patience ran out? That's when I realized I needed to take control of the situation somehow, to gather evidence that would be undeniable. The plan formed slowly. I researched everything I could about stalker psychology, about what made them escalate, about how other victims had successfully gathered evidence. I read academic papers, true crime accounts, psychology textbooks. I became an expert in the thing I hated most. What I learned was that stalkers like Roger rarely stop on their own. They either escalate to violence, find a new target, or are stopped by outside intervention. Waiting for him to lose interest wasn't an option. His obsession had only grown over months. Finding a new target would just make someone else suffer. That left intervention. But as I'd learned, getting that intervention required evidence the system couldn't ignore or explain away. Photos of his shrine, proof of the extent of his surveillance, something that showed premeditation and danger. And the only way to get that evidence was to get close enough to access his private spaces. The decision to drug him wasn't made lightly. I researched carefully, making sure the dose would be safe, that it wouldn't interact with any medications he might be on. I felt sick planning it, knowing it was wrong, but feeling trapped with no other options. The system that should have protected me had failed, and I was left to protect myself however I could. I practiced the plan obsessively. How I would act, what I would say, how long I had before the medication wore off. I set up contingencies. Emma knew to call the police if she didn't hear from me by a certain time. I wore a recording device. I was as prepared as I could be for something so dangerous. What I found in that room validated every instinct I'd had, every fear that had been dismissed. This wasn't social awkwardness or misunderstood romance. This was predation, obsession, detailed planning for my captivity. The relief of having proof was almost as overwhelming as the horror of what that proof showed. After Roger's arrest, I thought the hard part was over. I was wrong. The trauma had carved deep grooves in my psyche that didn't magically heal with his imprisonment. The hypervigilance, the fear, the inability to trust. These became my constant companions. Therapy helped, but it was slow work. EMDR sessions where I had to relive the worst moments to process them. Cognitive behavioral therapy to challenge the thought patterns that kept me trapped in fear. Group therapy with other trauma survivors who understood the complexity of healing. There were setbacks, panic attacks in grocery stores, nights where I checked the locks until my fingers were raw, times when a stranger's innocent interest sent me spiraling. Healing isn't linear, and I had to learn to be patient with myself. Moving to a new state felt like running away at first. I worried I was letting Roger win by leaving the home I'd loved, but my therapist reframed it. I wasn't running from something. I was running toward something. Toward peace, toward healing, toward a life not defined by fear. The new city offered anonymity that felt like freedom. No one knew my story. I could go to coffee shops without wondering if Roger had been there. I could walk in parks without checking over my shoulder constantly. Slowly, very slowly, I began to reclaim pieces of myself I thought were lost forever. I started gardening again, in containers on my balcony at first. The first tomato I grew made me cry. Not from fear, but from joy. I'd taken back something he'd stolen. Each plant that thrived felt like a small victory against the darkness he'd tried to trap me in. Dating remained complicated. The first time Thomas from my hiking group asked me for coffee, I said no reflexively. But he was patient, maintaining friendship without pressure. When I finally told him my story, expecting him to run, he simply asked how he could help me feel safe. His matter-of-fact acceptance was healing in itself. Our first date was in a well-lit public place I chose, with Emma on standby. Thomas understood why I needed to drive myself, why I texted Emma throughout the evening, why I tensed when he moved too quickly. His patience and understanding showed me what healthy interest looked like. Consistent, respectful, with clear boundaries. The advocacy work grew from my need to make meaning from trauma. Every law I help change, every officer I educate, every victim I support is a step toward ensuring others don't suffer as I did. It doesn't erase what happened, but it transforms it into something useful. I still have nightmares sometimes. Not as frequently, but they come in waves, usually triggered by anniversaries or similar news stories. In them, Roger has escaped, and no one believes me. I wake gasping, reaching for my phone to check the prison database, confirming he's still locked away. But I also have good dreams now. Dreams where I'm strong, where I defend myself, where the system works as it should. My therapist says these reflect my growing sense of empowerment, my brain rewriting the narrative from victim to survivor. The impact on my family continues. My mother still calls too frequently. My father still offers to visit whenever I sound tired. They're processing their own trauma from watching their daughter terrorized while feeling helpless to stop it. We're all in therapy now, individually and sometimes together, working through the ripple effects of Roger's actions. I've learned that surviving stalking changes your relationship with fear itself. I'm no longer afraid of normal things, public speaking, job interviews, difficult conversations. When you've lived with true terror, everyday anxieties lose their power. It's a strange silver lining to a terrible experience, but I'm also more aware of genuine danger. I trust my instincts implicitly now. If something feels wrong, I act on that feeling without second-guessing. This has served me well, helping me avoid several situations that could have been problematic. My body learned to recognize threat, and I trust its wisdom. The financial recovery took years. Building back my client base, paying off the debt accumulated during the worst months, establishing security in my new life. It all took time and effort. But I'm proud of the business I've rebuilt. Stronger now with boundaries I didn't have before. I often think about the other women Roger stalked, especially Jennifer Moss. Her family started a foundation in her name after learning the full truth about her death. They channel their grief into action, funding research and support services. Meeting them was one of the hardest things I've done, but also one of the most important. You stopped him, Jennifer's mother told me, holding my hands. You did what my daughter couldn't, what the system didn't let her do. You saved lives. The weight of that, the responsibility, and the honor stays with me. There are still hard days. Seeing a telescope in a store window, hearing about another woman killed by a stalker the system ignored. Realizing I'm checking locks more than usual, a sign that stress is triggering old patterns. But these days pass, and I have tools now to cope with them. The biggest lesson I've learned is that healing happens in community. The other survivors who share their stories, the advocates who fight for better laws, the friends who stood by me. the therapist who guides me, the partner who loves me despite my scars. We heal together, not alone. To those reading this who recognize themselves in my story, who are living with fear and hypervigilance, who jump at shadows and check locks obsessively, you're not crazy. You're not overreacting. You're responding normally to an abnormal situation. Trust yourself. Seek help. Document everything. And know that survival is possible even when it feels impossibly hard. The system that failed me is slowly changing. Not fast enough, not comprehensively enough, but changing nonetheless. Every survivor who speaks up, every law that passes, every officer who takes training seriously, these are steps toward a world where stories like mine become rarer. I chose to share this story in all its painful detail because silence protects predators, not victims. Roger counted on my silence, on my fear, on the system's indifference. Breaking that silence, refusing to be ashamed, transforming trauma into advocacy. This is how we fight back. My name is Sarah, and I am a stalking survivor. I live with the scars of that experience every day, but I also live with joy, with love, with purpose. Roger tried to make me small, to trap me in fear, to own my story. He failed. This is my story, and I choose how it continues. To my fellow survivors, your story matters. Your voice matters. Your healing matters. We stand together, a community forged in fear but bound by strength. We deserve safety. We deserve justice. We deserve lives free from terror. And to Roger, still in your cell, still obsessed, still believing in a love that never existed, you lost. Not because you're in prison, but because you couldn't break me. I survived you. I thrived despite you. And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure others survive too. This is Sarah, truly signing off now, but never silencing. The story continues, not as a victim's tale, but as a survivor's triumph. And that's a story worth telling, again and again, until everyone who needs to hear it knows they're not alone. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing. And thank you for being part of the change we desperately need. Together, we're rewriting the ending to these stories. One voice, one law, one saved life at a time. Stay safe, stay strong, and always, always trust yourself.